Okay, so if depression is not caused by chemical imbalances in the brain, which is what we've thought for decades, what is it caused by?
So what we've disproved is the main theory of the chemical imbalance, which involves serotonin, one of the brain chemicals. The original justification, which was the idea that antidepressants correct some sort of underlying chemical imbalance, particularly a deficiency of serotonin, has not been shown to be supported by scientific evidence.
What are the implications here for big pharmaceutical companies who've made an absolute fortune out of this over decades?
Yes, so it was the pharmaceutical companies that first started promoting this idea that depression is due to a chemical imbalance in order to, obviously, to increase sales of their antidepressants.
You know, all drugs of abuse affect fundamental motivational or emotional systems. That's why we take them. The big categories are pain relieving, anxiety relieving, and psychomotor stimulant. And most drugs of abuse fall into those categories. And then there's the hallucinogens, which are their whole other universe. I'm also interested in religious experiences, and for one reason or another, and it's a bottomless mystery, there are agents that reliably produce religious experiences. And no one knows what in the world to do about that. You know, we think in stories and we see the world through a structure of value. I think that has been proven beyond a doubt by neuroscientists and psychologists. And the fact that we see the world through a prism of value seems to indicate that there's something about value that's real. Our culture grew out of the Bible. It's grounded in the Bible, for better or worse. And so if you want to know who you are and why you think the way you think, like you think you know the way you think. You think you think. You don't. Or very rarely. Like the thoughts are greater than you are, in some sense. I mean, and it's very rare that you think something that someone else hasn't thought. The deepest values are religious, and our religious document is the Bible, and the Bible is an absolute mystery. The deepest questions are religious questions, and the Bible is the best answer we have. And if you don't like that, well, fine, do better. Good luck.
I needed to feel like I was wholly responsible for myself and what happened to me. That I was not going to let myself slide.
There's an ideal calling to you then, eh? Like when you experience yourself as ashamed by your own behaviors, what that means is that there's an ideal inside you that's trying to manifest itself, right? Because you wouldn't be ashamed if you weren't comparing yourself to something better. And the question then becomes, well, what is that better thing that you're comparing yourself to? And it's an ideal. And then the question becomes, well, what is the ideal? You know, and that's the sort of fleshing out what that ideal is that's the function of religious thinking. And so that's why I was interested in your comment about agnosticism. You know, in Revelation, in the book of Revelation, Christ comes back as a judge. Even though he's a figure of mercy, let's say, he comes back as a judge. And the reason for that, this is from Carl Jung, the reason for that is that any ideal is a judge. And so if you posit the highest ideal, then you put yourself in a position where you're judged, and that's when your conscience tortures you.
Yep.
And so you can discover your ideal that way by having a dialogue with your conscience and say, well, I'm not living up to who I should be. Well, who should that be? Like, where does that figure come from? Well, that's a great mystery, that. You know, that doesn't mean that it's responsibility that's at the top of the hill.
Okay.
In the West, I mean, in some ways, Christ is represented as taking the responsibility for all the sins of mankind unto himself, right? Well, that's responsibility. And look, to the degree that each of us are trying to sort out in our own souls complex problems that bedevil other people, we're doing that in a low resolution form, right? We're taking the fragility and errors and malevolence of mankind onto ourselves and trying to sort that out. And that's meaningful, although it's also extremely burdensome. And, it can kill you, it can crush you. And so the responsibility has to be tempered in a variety of ways to make it even bearable. One of the things that's so interesting about the Christian story, in my estimation, is that responsibility is so overwhelming that, it was even daunting for God himself. So that's built into the story. And said, well, that doesn't differentiate Christ much from a whole sequence of dying and resurrecting mythological gods. And of course, people have made that claim in comparative religion. The difference, and C.S. Lewis pointed this out as well, the difference between those mythological gods and Christ was that there's a historical representation of his existence as well. Now, you can debate whether or not that's genuine. You can debate about whether or not he actually lived and whether there's credible objective evidence for that, but it doesn't matter in some sense because it does, but there's a sense in which it doesn't matter because there's still a historical story. And so what you have in the figure of Christ is an actual person who actually lived plus a myth. And in some sense, Christ is the union of those two things. The problem is I probably believe that, but I don't know. I'm amazed at my own belief and I don't understand it. Because I've seen sometimes the objective world and the narrative world touch. That's Jungian synchronicity. And I've seen that many times in my own life. And so in some sense, I believe it's undeniable. We have a narrative sense of the world. For me, that's been the world of morality. That's the world that tells us how to act. It's real. We treat it like it's real. It's not the objective world. But the narrative and the objective world touch. And the ultimate example of that, in principle, is supposed to be Christ. But I don't know that seems to me oddly plausible.
Yeah.
But I still don't know what to make of it. Partly because it's too terrifying a reality to fully believe. I don't even know what would happen to you if you fully believed it. And so I would say there's something like a central spirit that we're all driven to imitate. And it's the thing that we see as admirable across people. Yeah. And that points to something that we experience as religious. So the ultimate expression of that which compels imitation is indistinguishable from religious worship. It's not propositional.
What is it that we all share? Now, here's something else that I was thinking about. Right now we're speaking to one another in podcast form. So in some sense, we're copying this. You can think of this archetypally. In some sense, we're copying podcasts by doing so. When one is playing rock music, one is copying rock in some, because no one speaks with a twang. Where do you develop that? You're copying something. Then I thought, well, how far can you take that? When you're doing art in general, what are you copying? Okay, how far can that be taken? How about if you're simply,
man, that's exactly it.
Right. How about if you're simply living, laying bare? What are you copying? Is by simply existing and living, is that a reflection of that? What you're copying is God's essence in some manner. That is abstracted completely.
Well, I don't think there's any difference. I don't think there's any difference between imitation and worship. They're the same thing. That's why the Eastern Orthodox types lay such emphasis on the imitation of Christ. Well, you should worship. Well, Pajot, he says, well, that means enthusiastically celebrate, right? Raise to the highest position. Well, then you imitate that. You imitate that which is of most value. It's interesting, when Christ comes back in the book of Revelation, and he's the judge, so he's separating the damned from the saved, let's say. He says something very strange. He says, if you are neither hot nor cold, I will spit you out of my mouth. He actually says vomit. It's a disgust reaction. And it's this idea that the worst sin is to play both sides against the middle. that sometimes you'll lie and sometimes you'll tell the truth. You know, you won't commit to something because you want it both ways, and that's the worst possible. Well, so let's say you commit to lies. Well, maybe you'll find out pretty quickly that that's a hell of a thing to do and learn.
What if you